Well, thank you. And we are live right now. Do you prefer Dr. Levine or Peter, or how would you like me to address you?
Peter is fine.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So for those of you that are listening and following, this is Dr. Peter Levine, and he is the founder of Somatic Experiencing. And for the purposes of really being efficient with our time, there are lots of videos, lots of explanations that you can look up on the definition of somatic experiencing. And this interview is really assuming that you have that basic definition, or you will be able to go to find that basic definition. And we will jump into some of the layers beneath that and around it that have been submitted by those of you that submitted questions as well. And so with that, we will jump into just a starter question, which is, can you explain, Peter, your definition of trauma?
Okay. That's probably the most difficult question, and in some ways, most revealing question. Trauma occurs when we're overwhelmed with fear and experience that we're not able to respond. So it's fear and helplessness. And it runs on a whole spectrum, of course. I mean, there are times when, we're frightened or scolded or shamed, but at the same time, there are times when we're completely overwhelmed and we're absolutely unable to respond and to act, and to be able to envision a future that's different than the past. So you could say, in the most simple definition, quite frankly, is that trauma is a disorder of not being able to be in the here and now, because we're in the there and then. And we don't have memories of this, conscious memories of this, but our body does different things that responds to different cues. One example, very familiar, is, I think probably to most of your viewers, is the way people respond, for example, who have been abused, respond to touch, because that triggers a whole helplessness chain of different times when they felt helplessness, often in young childhood. Then we all of a sudden find ourselves attracted to somebody who's not good for us. Again, these are these kind of links, and they're not conscious memories at all. They're what are called procedural and emotional memories. Again, responses of the body that happen way outside the realm of consciousness. And this is very confusing, not only to lay people, but also to therapists. Actually, that was the motivation for writing my last book, Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in a Search for the Living Past. Because it's the past that lives in us through our reactions, not through our conscious memories, not at all through our conscious memories. So I see that really as kind of like this definition of being compelled to act or to underreact.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, again, this whole realm of unconscious processes that keep us from being able to be in the here and now.
I found it interesting when I was reading some of your definitions, and the definitions actually of trauma is trauma is not always event-based. Trauma can come through a difficult birth when you don't even remember. And trauma can be a culmination of small events leading to, I don't know what you call the pinnacle of trauma.
Yeah. The accumulative stresses, toxic stresses that they add up, they even more than add up, they multiply. So a person can be exposed to a lot of these, sometimes they're called small T traumas. Mm-hmm. And then after the 30th small T trauma, something again happens, which would probably only be a small T trauma for them previously, then becomes like a big T trauma, and they person collapses. There are two basic responses to threat. One is the very well-known fight or flight response.
Mm-hmm.
The other is less known, and that's freezing and collapse. You know, when people talk about opossums, they say playing opossums. And that's sometimes called cold fear. They're not playing dead. It's a profound physiological reaction. It goes deep, it's deeply in their, again, in their procedural memories, in their emotional procedural memories that, that drive them into this freezing and this collapse. You know, it's like, it's probably comes from the what's called energy conservation. So if you're in a very bad situation, a very toxic situation or accumulation of toxic situations, the whole body, the whole metabolism shuts down to a low level, waiting for the situation to change. However, the situation doesn't change because we're continually recreating the situations in our bodies and minds and bodies and brains.
And you go into, and again, people can look this up, but you use nature and animals as really the definition in helping to explain this, where, you know, they'll freeze and act dead, and then, you know, the cheetah will come in and try to eat the antelope, and then it has an interaction with the hyenas and so forth, and then the cheetah can get, or the antelope can ultimately get away. So it's almost a survival mechanism.
No, it's completely a survival mechanism, and it in many, many ways. For example, if an animal, a prey animal, is immobile, is not moving, in other words, appears to be dead, not meeting the predator with a struggle gives the predator this aversion, because, and I think this probably again comes from what happens in the wild, in nature, because if they eat a carcass that's been infected, say that has parasites or bacteria, you know, so you just avoid all inert animals, prey animals. So it has probably value in that. What's very common also in this shutdown state, and often people who are stuck there have gastrointestinal problems. I'll talk about that in a little bit if you want.
Sure.
But so they may vomit or have diarrhea. And again, this is something, the smells which probably inhibit aggression from the predator. And so they avoid that carcass and then, or that apparently dead carcass, and then just go off looking for a livelier prey. So it has tremendous value. The problem is in the wild, when animals go into that, it's time limited. They go into it, the predator leaves the scene, and then they come back, and then they're off. So as though nothing had happened. So my wondering was, okay, if animals do this and they go into this state, why don't humans do it? And that was the question I've really spent my whole life trying to address. In my first book, Waking the Tiger. Which has to do with your experience with Nancy. That's right. Yeah. That's right. And then really culminating it in more technical physiological understanding when I wrote In an Unspoken Voice. So this has been really the thread of my entire explorations over the last 45 years, really. Yeah, and I know that you've impacted thousands, probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives with it. And so I'll collectively thank you from all of us. And the science continues. What do you find that has been the biggest aha moment in the last couple of years around this? Wow, that's a good question. Anyhow, let me just finish one thing about the last one. Okay, so animals go into this state, and then they come out of it, and they go off to live another day. What is it that keeps people stuck in this response? And why don't they do what animals do? So when I observed what happened with Nancy,
Mm-hmm.
and then also observed wild animals in their wild environment, in their natural environment, wild animals, I saw all very specific kinds of physiological responses: shaking, trembling, deep spontaneous breaths, changes in temperature and skin color, etc. That it was really very, very similar, if not identical. But again, what is it that keeps us stuck so that we don't come out? And what I discovered, this is my great insight at that time, and I'm not trying to avoid your question.
No, I understand. Thank you.
Was that the very sensations of coming out of the immobility response, the collapse, freezing collapse response, the very sensations frighten people who have been traumatized, because it seems to them like the trauma is happening again. So they do whatever they can to tamp down on it, to not feel it. But that's the sensation, the intensity of the sensation that would take them out. Because if the cheetah is chasing down the impala, and then the impala comes out of the immobility, it runs off again as nothing had happened. So all of that energy gets utilized in escape. With humans, that doesn't happen because of our fear of those sensations. So in somatic experiencing, we take people very gently, one small piece at a time, to visit those sensations and to be able to process them and move through them. So that was really my main insight at that time. And that happened probably in the early 70s.
And you've actually defined that as a titration process right now based on science theory?
That's right. Exactly. I call it titration. Again, one small amount at a time. The image of that, or the metaphor for that, I discovered really was from chemistry. So if you have two vessels, two beakers, one that has a hydrochloric acid, which is one of the strongest acids known, and the other one, caustic soda, lye, which is also, either one by itself would destroy skin and would cause blindness and so forth. They're very powerful chemicals. And if you put them together, you actually would wind up with water and salt, which are the two main ingredients two of the main ingredients of life. But the problem is, this would happen in the aftermath of an explosion. So if you put them together, they would explode. And when I took college chemistry, we were warned to be very, very careful when mixing those two components, because the energy released was so vast. Well, that's the same thing with trauma. That energy that's locked in the trauma is so vast, it has to happen one drop at a time. So if you have, say, a beaker, a glass full of sodium hydroxide, lye, NaOH, and then you have what's called a stopcock. So you can introduce the hydrochloric acid one drop at a time. So you open it, there's one drop, and you get a sizzling, but no explosion. Then you wait a little bit, then you open the next drop to come down. Then also a little bit of a psh, like an Alka-Seltzer fish. And after you did, 20 or 30 times, all of a sudden you see salt forming in the beaker, and then the release, and also the release of water, of water vapor. So again, the key is in accessing these vital elements of life. The key is in not overwhelming the person, because if the person is overwhelmed, the nervous system really can't tell the difference between being overwhelmed and the original trauma. And so that was also an important insight at the time. Yeah. Okay. You asked me now for my what was it? My main,
most recent, biggest aha.
Yeah. Well, this is really very important in my life right now. So appreciate your asking the question.
Thank you.
Over the years, I've probably worked with thousands of people who are suffering from what we now call fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, chronic fatigue, migraine, severe PMS, urinary problems, and so forth. And these are actually called MUS, which means medically unknown symptoms, unexplained symptoms.
Interesting.
It is very interesting. So basically, medicine has given up on those kind of conditions. And so again, I realized that over the decades, I worked with so many people who have had these conditions, and in the great majority, actually starting from Nancy, their symptoms have been greatly reduced, if not, transformed, if not eliminated. So the question is, and because there are literally tens of millions of people suffering from those kind of conditions.
Is it growing? Is it on the rise, would you say?
I would definitely say so.
Yeah.
We can talk about maybe some of the reasons for that, but it definitely is on the rise. And many of these people, again, they'll go from physician to physician and not even get a diagnosis until they've seen 6 or more physicians, and then one will say, maybe you have fibromyalgia and irritable bowel. Sometimes after going through many tests. Now you have to, of course, when a person has symptoms, you have to check up and see that these symptoms aren't caused by something that's medical. But the vast majority, I would imagine well over 90%, don't have anything medically wrong with them, but they do have those symptoms. And so the insight came a couple of years ago when I was in Boston, and I realized that maybe these people could be helped by being guided in the same way a similar way that I guided my clients. So we started, and we're in the process of completing our work on the initial thing, is a online program, an app that can help people move out of these symptoms, out of these shutdown states, and back into life. So I put so much energy, and I'm working with a partner who is an inventor, a serial entrepreneur, and MIT genius who works with computer-human interaction, and then a couple of programmers. So we've been working, really working on this.
I bet.
And my insight is that, wow, maybe we could, because we have now a total of trainees around the world of about 30,000.
Yeah.
Which kind of blows my mind, actually.
Congratulations.
But still, that's minuscule to the need of people, who have these kind of conditions, as well as trauma. And so we're going to see about how this, we did a proof of concept, which was very productive. And so I'm a little bit, on tender hooks, holding my breath on tender hooks to mix
Welcome to entrepreneurship.
Right, to really bring a team together.
Yeah.
Because this is not something I could not do alone. I really absolutely couldn't alone. So I really need, and it's a wonderful feeling to work with people who are in completely different realms than you are. And don't even really have a common language at first. Yeah. So over this last couple of years, we've really got to understand each other's language. And they've also done, a few sessions with me, somatic experiencing sessions, so they know what it feels like from the inside. And so that's my insight, that conceivably millions of people could be helped while I'm sleeping. Yeah, good. Well, and that's really part of the concern that a lot of people who submitted questions, and I know that you've talked about it before, is, the importance for us to empower patients to manage their own states of safety or autonomy. Yep, absolutely. You know, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of things on YouTube, and most of those I've never seen. But the one is a short documentary, like a half-hour documentary, that was made of a Marine named Ray, who was blown up by two of these IEDs and was suffering from all kinds of symptoms, including traumatic brain injury. And this was after his best friend died in his arms in a firefight. So you really see how he goes from shutdown back into aliveness. And what he says at the last session, Esalen Institute is where I do a lot. I used to do a fair amount of my workshops there. I was able to get him to come there on a scholarship. And at the end, my technical person, Justin, was interviewing him outside while I was finishing the group. And he said, well, when I first met Dr. Levine and first started to do this, I thought this was the biggest crock of, you know what.
Right.
But then I realized not only could it help me, but I could learn to do the things that he did with me and also do them on my own. And that's really important, because you really want to empower people. You don't want people to be utterly dependent on a therapist. I mean, look, some people have very complicated trauma, and it takes a while to work through that. There's no question about that. But at the same time, if you empower people when they're ready, when they can have authentically autonomous relationship to themselves, then they work on these kind of things. And you were talking about a lot of people here are in recovery and so forth. Yeah. Well, what happens when people are
well, much of it is trauma based.
Much of it is trauma based, no question about that. And the field now really recognizes that. I consult for the Meadows Treatment Center in Arizona, and basically we've set up a really full trauma-based program there. So I think more and more people are recognizing that. But if we look about relapse, there's also usually there's some kind of a trigger, right? And that then leads to the behavior. So whether it's drinking or taking a pill or opening the refrigerator and, pulling out and, engorging and then throwing up. I mean, all of these things do have triggers. And if we can actually take the time, and this is the key, to experience the effect of the trigger on our bodily experiences, and then be able to be with the body experiences and let them settle, then the compulsion is greatly diminished. So again, we want people to develop those skills. So when, not if, but when the triggers occur, when they meet a friend that they used to, be smoking marijuana with or something, right? They'll be able to feel something in their body, and maybe it's something like, I don't really want to be with this person. Or when the person says, hey, you want to smoke, and say, no, I'm not smoking anymore, or whatever it is. Yeah. But again, it's having the bodily experience that lets us know when we're being triggered, and that we don't have to become compulsively driven by those triggers.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've talked to a number of experts on the neuroscience of addiction and trauma, and there's definitely a connection between the neurology and the physiology of trauma, and it's manifested physiologically. But would you say it's the chicken before the egg, or the egg? Is it driven from a core neurological response in wiring that is then manifested physically?
Well, when I started to develop somatic experiencing at the very beginning in 1969, at that time, trauma wasn't even known. Yeah. But it wasn't really till 1981, I think 81, 82, that the definition of trauma as PTSD came into the lexicon of diagnosis, the DSM the Bible of diagnosis and insurance billing, the DSM. Anyhow, at that time, it was believed that trauma was a brain disorder, that the best you could do was manage it with drugs or with, talk therapy, with cognitive therapy. And thankfully, when I started my search, I didn't know that yet. I didn't know that there was supposed to be.
You hadn't been mentally corralled yet.
Right. And if you go through the video of Ray, who has traumatic, one of the many diagnoses. Yeah. By the way, it's if you go to Ray's story, Somatic Experiencing, Peter Levine, you can see those the vignettes of those 5 sessions.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And where was I going with that? Help me.
We've been fairly fluid here. So
I know. Okay, I got it.
And let me pause just a sec. I dropped some of my question sheets. You can go ahead. Okay. So he was diagnosed with depression, PTSD, Tourette syndrome, chronic pain, depression, and traumatic brain injury. Now, if traumatic brain injury is due to an injury in the brain, then doing those sessions shouldn't have changed that radically, which it did. Now, I'm not saying things aren't going on in the brain. Of course they are. Right.
You and I talking together right now, we can't do that without our brains. We're changing each other's brains, really. If we're answering a question or thinking about something, or what I mean, there is a shift that's going on. And one of the things that is talked about very widely, particularly in the mindfulness community, is what's called neuroplasticity.
Yep.
And neuroplasticity basically means that our brains can change. They change dramatically during childhood and into adolescence, but now it's really been demonstrated unequivocally that it occurs all through adulthood. So for example, things like neurofeedback, where you're actually changing the different functions of the brain, that's also a way that we can change these patterns that get set in the brain, to interrupt them and to allow for new patterns to emerge. So it's not one or the other. They all work together. And, of course, understand that certain addictions work on the internal opioid system of the brain, the endorphin system. We also know very clearly that some operate on the dopamine system, the stimulants and amphetamines and misuse of ecstasy. They all have to do with people overstimulating their dopamine system. And so when the system is overstimulated, it doesn't react to healthy stimulation, which are motivations in life. So yes, having a neurological understanding, a neurobiological understanding, is also valuable in understanding addiction and understanding also what happens in recovery and in lapses.
Okay. How would you say the approach is changing to what you would previously, I've heard you refer to it as the Bliss Bypass? Yeah.
One of the things that
maybe we should define what that is.
Yeah. Well, this Bliss Bypass in the meditation community is when people will meditate. Very often, the people who are attracted to meditation are very often people with a lot of trauma. And so what happens is, in the meditation, they get to a bliss state. And then they want to keep going to that. But they've bypassed the effect that their trauma has had on them. And so they try to, in a way, distance themselves from the trauma by having these beatific experiences.
Hmm.
And that's what I call, at least, the bliss bypass. So we don't work with our traumas. We don't work with our developmental and characterological issues. Why would we? Because the bliss really is the end game.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've worked, for example, but this doesn't last. So very often the person will then become very dissociative.
Well, that's how addiction is too, with drugs or whatever.
That's
it's a
right.
temporary state.
Yep, exactly. You're introducing some kind of dissociative state. So what happened with Nancy, and she was again at the end of the session, when she opened her eyes and reported what had happened, she said that she felt like she was being held in warm, tingling waves of warmth and tingling and aliveness.
Hmm.
So I thought, well, that's really interesting. And later, as PTSD became defined, I thought, one of the things that wasn't written about is that as people worked through their traumas, as did Nancy, they use the experience, these types of spiritual experiences. But what transforming trauma can do, it can open these doors. So we get an experience of that landscape, but it doesn't take us through the doors. For that, we have to do our own personal and trauma work. But to have the door open is a big thing. There's a lot of interest now in using ecstasy or MDMA.
I was going to ask you about that, the role of psychedelics right now.
Right. Well, it's very interesting, because in the 1970s, I was actually using it because it was completely legal then.
Yeah.
But, that's certainly not the only psychedelic drug. LSD, ayahuasca, Ibogaine, many others, MDA.
Mm-hmm.
And they all act somewhat similarly and also somewhat differently. And they allow us to experience these deep states and also to develop more self-compassion. So it's very valuable. But by itself, I think it's a mistake to consider that to be the therapy, but it can open some of these doors and help, especially when we're working with situations, so-called moral injury among vets, it can be very valuable. But you have to then do the on-the-ground work, because especially also these things occur in a deeply altered state of consciousness. And what we need to do is be able to access these openings, but in the ordinary waking consciousness. So again, that's where you need to do that trauma work on the non-drug state.
Yeah.
So but anyhow, one laughs about this again, because in the 60s, of course, everybody was using those kind of substances.
Yeah.
And they got a lot of people into a lot of trouble because they would go to the bliss bypass and dissociate from the trauma and from the emotional wounds.
Well, in the context of, going to the bliss bypass through Ibogaine or whatever the case is, I've heard of individuals who have landed it. They've had the openings or the awakenings presented to them. And then without a place to land that is safe and controlled post, they actually hit a higher state of trauma because they don't know how to associate or manage the awakenings.
I recently in Switzerland, I saw this guy, and he was part of a very, very deep meditation practice. And he'd been doing this for like 16 years. And then, boom, out of the blue, he was flooded by these images from his early childhood. But he had no way to deal with them. So one thing led to another, and I did a couple of sessions with him. And the heads of the organization noticed so much the change in him, positive change in him, that, you know, they invited me to come there and to do some teaching there about meditation and trauma and meditation. So the trauma, it won't go away.
Yeah.
It will not go away. And until one meets it and moves through it or transforms it, it's going to be a destructive force, usually way down in the roots of these implicit processes, these implicit memory processes.
So how does one decide, or because we have a lot of people who are just loved ones of people who are experiencing trauma. We have generational trauma and addiction as well. And so we talk a lot about self-management, and there are a number of questions around self-management. But how do you know it's time to engage professional help? And this is way beyond self-management, because
that's an important question. And actually, ideally, it's some of both. You know, one of the things that spouses learn, you know, when they've been successful is, and this is fairly typical among vets, they'll, you know, wake up in terror. And it's not even a nightmare, it's beyond a nightmare. It's a night terror.
Yeah.
And they're really back in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And it can be dangerous, of course, to the spouse. But some spouses are able to say, Michael, you're here. You're okay. You're here. And sometimes something like that is enough to bring them down. But most certainly, they'll also, well, there's no question, they'll greatly benefit from getting appropriate professional help. But there's a lot that you can do. The one where things are really the most trying for spouses is with addiction, because they see their husbands or their wives go into their demons with these different substances. And there's really not anything they can do except to say, look, I'm here. And, you know, but it's very, very common. And I've seen this, at first it was very striking to me. Now I just notice it as just kind of like lay of the land, is that sometimes the person will actually leave, for example, alcohol around. Or I know mothers have left their pain medications in the medicine cabinet, where obviously the addicted son is going to find them. So then they need to do work on so-called codependency. I mean, that's what it is. And
this is a very interesting scenario, and I'm going to jump in for respect of your time too, to the questions that were submitted. But we actually have a woman who submitted this question around this very specific topic. She says, I notice a sense of deep sadness and guilt because I'm unable to, and believe me, I've tried, to enable my husband and nephew, both who are alcohol dependent. AA meetings made me feel guilty that I could be an enabler if I'm not doing something about their drinking. What do I do for myself, and how far and how could I influence them constructively?
Such an important question. First of all, what you can do for yourself is to work with yourself. Really, that's far and above the most important thing. And because you're not going to be able to change them. And if you think you are, then you're in a fool's folly. I don't mean to say that in a negative way, because I know it's the very
Well, it's important to be fairly blunt about it, I think.
Yeah, and to experience your sadness. You know, I have a very dear friend who's a severe alcoholic, one of my very dearest friends. And I and a number of our friends, have tried to do something. And it's just not going to happen. So I feel the sadness that we're going to lose him sooner than could be. I feel very, very deeply sad about that. But I've also accepted that there's nothing that I can do. And I think when the spouses or the people who are closest to the person, say, suffering from alcoholism, is, certainly, not to buy alcohol for them. And I've seen that in many, many cases. But to find your own truth. To find your own truth. And that's very most likely is going to have a component of a lot of sadness, because ultimately we know we're not going to be able to change somebody, who's addicted to a substance. But we can hopefully give them access to therapists or 12-step programs or so forth that can be helpful when the person finally realizes how destructive this is and has a moment of clarity. That's when you can be ready to say, I'm really, really moved by what you just told me. And I know there are these groups, or I know there's a really good treatment program or a really good therapist or something like that. So when the person comes to a little bit of that clarity, because with alcohol and opioids, the person is in a fog of dissociation and disconnection. So to take care of yourself, that's the very first thing. That's the most important thing. And from that, other things can unfold. But again, if you're seeing it's you out of your guilt, that it's your responsibility to change the person, you're only going to be manufacturing more and more failure and guilt on your part.
Yeah. All right, next question. And this is one about somatic experiences. Somebody has been through the process, and she says, the experiences are so intense and come in waves from nightly to none for months at a time. There are no visuals, only the sounds of footsteps approaching my door, followed by the sound of whispering in my ear and the prickly sensation of those whispers. My body convulses. I feel about 3 years old and I sob. The terror is intense, like I'm about to be attacked. I usually black out within a couple of minutes. I know that what these experiences are connected to, a childhood sexual abuse from age 3 to 5. I know who the man is, but I have no visual memories of the abuse. And she's trying to figure out if it would be healthy or good to stimulate the visual memory.
Oh, gosh, I can really know that's coming from your heart. And a deep need in you. There's not a simple answer. A therapist who's skilled enough can guide this person to work with those procedural memories, those body memories, and be able to link them to what are called episodic memories. Those are, and usually involve different kinds of images and so forth. But this is part of a natural process. So it's not something you can say, well, since I'm not getting visual memories, should I try to get visual memories?
Well, it seems like and she goes on a little bit more, but she seems like she has a goal around having the visual memories, which is, to identify the perpetrator and also to save future victims. So there seems to be an association of guilt.
I get it.
As well.
Right. Well, no, that's important. If that's an active thing and when that person still is alive and in a position to do that kind of abuse, then yes, then it is, you do want to really support the person to recover enough of those images, and so they get a clear sense of a memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can, they can do something about that, including reporting it
Mm-hmm.
to authorities. So, which again is is something that, has been in the past, has been completely demoralizing, because sometimes the people they report it to kind of brush it off or think
Mm-hmm.
that they're making up these memories or something like that. Thankfully, with the priest abuse scandal and the Me Too movement,
Mm-hmm.
people are more likely to be believed now.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I would talk to your therapist, of the reason you want to try to recover some of those images.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the therapist to help you in that regard.
How brave.
Yeah, it really is. It really does take tremendous courage on your part. And I sense that from your question, your courage and your commitment to your own wholeness, your own health, and to protect others who might be damaged by this person, who might be abused by this person.
Why is it that so much of trauma seems to be linked to childhood experiences?
Well, those are the formative experiences that really determine how we're going to perceive the world from then on. Do we see the world as something that's inviting and exciting and nourishing? Or do we experience a world which is threatening and withholding?
Mm-hmm.
Our early experiences set those behavioral engrams into operation, and they continue to play out until we are able to change them. And this occurs at a time when the nervous system is really developing. So these memories, or these effects of trauma, become embedded more deep areas of the brain and the body experience. So, and again, if we are neglected, if we are abused, if we are chronically shamed, it's not only that they're happening to us, but they are us. We are bad. It's not that a bad thing happened, but we are bad. It's not that we were being shamed. It's that we are drowned in shame.
So if we were to bring that to the current state, does that mean that neglect, abuse, and shame are on the rise because we see such, our children, the teens are more depressed, there's higher anxiety levels. What is in your professional opinion, the cause of the spike here?
Good question. Not an easy answer.
Yeah.
I say there's definitely, one always seems worse than, your and your age, but it is, it really is. I'm not sure what it is, but it probably has to do with how stress is carried through from generation to generation. What's sometimes called generational trauma. And there are known mechanisms by which this occurs. This is no longer a flight of fantasy. This has definitely happened.
Yeah.
It's passed on from generation to generation, gets amplified as it's passed on from generation to generation. Actually, the last chapter in Trauma and Memory is about the effects that go on from one generation to the other. So they're powerful and they're cumulative. And a lot of this actually happens when the person was in utero, when they were a fetus, being exposed to the parent's stressors. We also have situations, and this is terrible, where we have both parents working to barely scrape by to make enough money to barely scrape by, and without a safety net, and also in the fear that if they ever got sick or something like that, they'd be out on the street. I mean, there's a horrible stress.
Which is a real scenario these days.
It is. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed, you know, because I do a lot of teaching in Europe and South America and Brazil, and when I would come back to U.S., even if I was in an area where there was real danger, you know, I would come here and I would see that people are so much more frightened here. And I think this is this stress that just gets passed on. And a lot has to do with, you know, with not having a social network and having both parents work and not offering the parents significant time after they have a child to get paid leave. You know, in Europe, especially in Scandinavia, parents get significant amount of time, and either spouse can, you know, take that time to be with the child. I mean, if you want a healthy society, you have to have healthy children. And in order to have healthy children, you have to have healthy relationships between the adults and the child.
Yeah.
And we don't have that here. And it's, again, one of the things that's contributing to this accumulation of generational stress and trauma. Yeah.
It seems to be something that weighs heavy on you.
Yes. It saddens me. It really saddens me. And yeah. And one hope that I have is in seeing that a lot of the children that I meet, that I know, some of them are really bright lights. Really bright lights. And I think that's what it's going to take to change the direction that our society has gone. It's not going to happen all at once. Those things generally don't. They happen a little bit at a time. And my comprehension about that myself is that I do what I can. And if everybody leaves the world in some way, even if it's one person, in a better way, then they are truly changing the world.
Yeah.
One at a time, but they're truly, truly changing the world.
Well, you've certainly made a big impact on it with your work. And we'll just wrap up with a couple of more questions here. But some of these questions have to do with the topic that we just talked about, which is essentially the state of being month to month and paycheck to paycheck. So many people need the professional help and need the proper tools. But due to health insurance on the rise and costs associated with professional support and therapy, and really the access to real professional support.
Right. You know,
how do they manage that?
Yeah. Again, I really appreciate you asking the question, whoever it is that asked the question. You know, the people who are trained in somatic experiencing, myself included, are privileged.
Yeah.
You know, we are.
It's true.
And so we also owe, in some ways, to give back to those who are not privileged, who were marginalized. And so one of the things I've been doing and encouraging my other teachers and students to be involved with is helping people in community mental health centers to use some of the skills that we've developed. Because these are people, very often a lot of inexperienced people, you know, young people who are like interns. They have an incredible caseload of very difficult cases. And they have to see, you know, many, many, many people during the day. And so they burn out. So
and there's high turnover too.
And there's very high turnover because people burn out.
Yeah.
And so we've been doing that, you know, some of that. And when I lived in Arizona, I did some trainings at the Hopi Guidance Center in Second Mesa in Chepovlivy. And it's interesting. I was just presenting at a conference on trauma and addiction in Scottsdale and Phoenix. And this woman came up to me, and I recognized her as being a Hopi. And we started a conversation, and she said, could you please do some kind of a training for us at our center? And I said, I will really work on that. I will get together, get people together so we can do that. So I think, again, some of these skills are, to be a therapist, SE therapist, remember, it's a 3-year training program.
Yeah.
12 sessions, 12 days per year. But we can also do things that really give some people some very basic tools that they can use. So to your response, I'm hoping that there'll be more and more access to mental health organizations that are working on grants and shoestrings so that people can get help. And I think that this could especially true in putting together groups where people also help each other.
Grassroots,
it takes one to stand in the dark alone. It takes 2 to let the light shine through. So working in dyads, working with people, lay people, to help develop these skills for yourselves and for others. So I see that, that we just scratched the surface of what we can do. And one of the things about, how horrendous things are, I don't think maybe 1/3 of the country doesn't realize that, but the great majority does. This is in a very strikingly frightening, upsetting situation. But at the same time, this has brought out so many people.
Yeah.
For example, this is just a record increase in the number of women who are running for offices, and many who've actually won elections. I see a lot of people doing grassroots work, say with immigration. So I see people rising, and it's almost like you have these 2 polarities. You have this one, which is taking children from their parents and locking them in cages. That's unimagimageable. That's really, I think, a crime against humanity.
Sounds like, 18th century.
Really, it's horrendous. But then people are saying, no, you can't do this. This is enough. So it's waking other people up. So I think in a way that you always see 2 polarities. And, I think it's from the I Ching, that the signpost of a great truth is that the opposite is also true. Well, of a trauma is that also the antidote for the trauma is also there. And so how do we really come together, those people who are learning about healing, so that they can be healing each other and also be ready to heal when the conditions improve, when the conditions change.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful statement. And the opposite of despair is hope.
That's right. And one evokes the other. And we have to, again, to be able to hold the 2 of these together in order to really transform and to move ahead in our lives, and to help heal the traumas in ourselves, in our families, really in our neighborhoods, in our societies, in our countries. And it just ripples out and ripples out and ripples out.
Now, in terms of actionable things that someone can do from home, I know that you've written a number of books. Which books would you recommend that have the most actionable things that they can do from home that they could get on Amazon or somewhere else?
Well, the basic ideas of trauma is the book I wrote in 1996 called Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. But the one, I also did one a few years later with Sounds True. And it's called Healing Trauma, a Pioneering Program for Restoring the Wisdom of Our Bodies, or something like that.
Good job.
It's what sounds true, trauma and memory.
Mm-hmm.
And that specifically has exercises, and it also has a CD, audio CD, where people can be guided through these exercises.
Mm.
So that's a really, I think, a very useful tool.
Yeah.
It's a thin little book, and I think they can do the whole thing online if they want with Sounds True. I'm pretty sure they have it on as an online format as well. And then in the next year, we'll be hopefully launching this program for people who have these kinds of physical symptoms.
Does it have a name yet? Working on it?
We're working on it. But yeah. But anyhow, those two books are a good beginning. Again, Waking the Tiger was written when there was only one other book about trauma written at that time.
Oh, amazing.
And that was Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, an excellent book. So, and now to go from where there were two books now to there were literally hundreds of books. It tells you something about the importance of trauma in our lives.
You woke the tiger.
Yeah, right. So Waking the Tiger to get the basic idea, and then the exercises and also the spiritual component are laid out in the book CD, Healing Trauma.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap up and thank you so much for your time. This has been just wonderful, and I know that the listeners are really going to love it. And this is somebody who submitted the question twice or a couple of times, so I want to make sure that we at least address it, just giving her A for effort. So she says that she's recently completed 2 years of SE therapy from a licensed practitioner and recently completed her sound Vipassana.
What was that?
Vipassana.
Vipassana, maybe.
Vipassana? Yeah, I just pronounced it wrong. Vipassana or Goenka course? I'm not sure.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
If it's Vipassana, that's a form of meditation, a mindfulness meditation that's based primarily on body sensations. And the two together, SE and Vipassana, go together beautifully. But again, you've got to work with the trauma first. And if you don't, when you do start the Vipassana, you will either dissociate or come to the trauma. So yes, those are two forms that go together. I mean, somatic experiencing goes very well with a lot of different things, like with yoga and even with CBT and cognitive processing and so forth. And it goes very, very, very well with the Vipassana traditions, or some of the Tibetan meditation traditions like Kunai, which again is very much body-based. And Reginald Ray, a colleague of mine from Boulder, he's one of the leading teachers of this kind of a Tibetan approach. So you can look up some of his work as well.
Reginald Ray?
Reggie Ray, yeah, Reginald Ray.
Okay. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
I thought you were really actually quite good questions.
Oh, thank you.
And in a way, I like it when I don't get the questions beforehand. I sort of like to be on the spot because more spontaneity comes and more heart comes.
Yeah.
And then also, talking to some of the people through answering questions, and you just really, I feel the sincerity. And the hunger that people have for
there were
healing.
A lot more behind those. We got over 100. And
wow.
So, and that was just a little bit of outreach. So there's definitely, you're a light on a hill, and many people are trying to navigate the path, which comes down to a lot of the details. And so we're just trying to support that as best we can, and very, very honored to have you on, and thank you so very much. And if there's anything we can do or I can do to support you in this and make a movement, just help one person or something of that nature. And when your app comes out, we would love to support that as well.
Definitely. Okay. That's terrific. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to leave you with one thought.
Thank you.
Trauma is a fact of life, but trauma does not have to be a life sentence.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, Eric, that's fine. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you. Hope to
Yeah.
meet you in person one day. Maybe
Yeah.
I can get.
Where are you, by the way? Where do
I'm
you
in
live?
Salt Lake City. Yeah.
Oh, no
Yeah.
kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I love some of those areas in southern Utah.
Oh, St. George and
St. George, the
Moab.
Cedar Breaks, Moab. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you ever make it out, I've got a vision of getting, the 4 Avengers of trauma together sometime soon. So
That would be fun.
yeah,
That would be fun.
that would be. Have a blessed day. Thank you
Okay,
so
you
much.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.